following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. I'm Ralph Tycho of the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and I have the privilege of introducing another episode of The Packaged Tourist, hosted by the Packaged Tourist in the magical mystery tour called Life, Matthew DiBiase.
Thank you, Ralph. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, our featured guest is author David Dupuis. David has been an author for the past 30 years. His works range from histories of his native Ontario, Canada, to 3 critically acclaimed biographies of NHL legends Terry Sawchuk, Pierre Pilote, and Red Kelly, the latter bio which earned the 2016 Ontario Speakers Award. All 3 hockey bios were written with the full cooperation of the players and or their families in question, and all 3 bios represent hockey literature at its finest. But today, David Dupuis ventures into the realm of historical fiction with the release of the first 2 volumes of what will be a 7-volume series called The Seven Keys of Hildegard. Volume 1, titled Of Mercy and of Death, and Volume 2, titled Of Love and of Betrayal. David, how and when did you first conceive of the idea of doing this 7-volume series on Hildegard?
Hi, Matthew. Well, it actually goes back quite a long way. Hildegard is fairly recent as far as using Hildegard into this historical fiction novel. But in the beginning, almost 40 years ago, when I was 20 years old, seems forever, that I had the idea of writing a book about a young boy who was destined to be the last pope at the end of the world. And I did write a couple of thousand pages, and life gets in the way, other books get in the way, job gets in the way, and the story was always pushed to the back of my mind. But I always came back to it, and then I guess about 4 years ago, my son and my daughter said to me, "Dad, enough with the hockey books. You got to get to that Pope story. We know it's been a dream of yours, and we've read it, and you've got to get to that." So I started researching saints and seers who all had visions and prophecies of the end times, and I came across Hildegard, and she had very in-depth prophecies of the end times, and she was quite a prolific writer, and actually she was an amazing lady, and a nun in the 12th century, and I chose her, and I used her talking points and her visions to mold them into my story, and I came across, I used Hildegard.
Now, the series is called The Seven Keys, so is it accurate to say she issued 7 prophecies? Is that correct, David?
She had many prophecies. She had prophecies about all kinds of things, but in regards to the end times, she had 5 prophecies that could be broken up into other parts, and I chose to use 7, and I molded some of her visions into fiction into the story. So 7, I don't know if you know, but 7 is almost the most magical number when it comes to religion, when it comes to science, when it comes to mathematics. And I thought 7 should be a catchy number to use for this series.
Okay. Now, please tell our listeners, what does Volume 1 of Mercy and of Death, where does it start? Can you give us like a brief overview without giving the game away? What does Volume 1 deal with? Where does it start and where does it end off? Okay, let's talk about Volume 1.
For sure. Every time I talk about these books, it's hard to give it away. But it's a historical fiction series. It starts basically in 1938 with some prologues going back a touch earlier to Fatima and to Hildegard's time, but the premise, the biggest part of the story takes place between 1938 and 1958, and each key has in it popes, bishops, events, the Second World War, the First World War, in Book One. And there are two main characters that I use almost as protagonists, and Angelo Roncalli, I don't want to give it away from what he is, but in Book One, he is a bishop and an archbishop and a cardinal. And he, along with a fellow by the name of Albino Luciani, who in Book One is a priest, and together they carry the story through the Second World War. The book follows them, but also in there, as any good story has, you've got good guys and bad guys, and you've got issues within the church. So yeah, it's a very tangled, intriguing web that I try to weave using history and fiction.
Now, when I read the first volume, you described there seemed to be a conspiracy. There's like this dark conspiracy, almost like a satanic group that dates back centuries, that seems to is doing everything it can to stop the prophecy of Hildegard from being fulfilled. Can you give us a little reveal about this sort of dark conspiracy of these evil people? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. In Book One, I introduce a character called the Oracles, and there are good guys called the Brethren who date back to the time of Hildegard, and there was a monk who did her writings for her by the name of Volmar, and the bad guys are a sect that are waiting for the arrival of the Antichrist, which does not happen in Book One just yet. It's setting the premise. And so they're basically a group that are dark forces, and they're having an inkling of the good guys who are the Brethren. And so throughout all 5 books, you'll have this battle between good and evil, and one side trying to thwart the other, one side trying to stay ahead. And in the middle of that, you get the Catholic Church that is intertwined, and the popes. And in the first book as well, you've got Pope Pius and you've got Hitler. And I allude to the fact that the dark forces also have a grip on Hitler and on the Nazis, and all drive his terrible war machine. And so they're not a real group like that you would have, that, there are so many conspiracies about in the world in the Da Vinci Code, if you recall. But in my historical fiction, I create this dark force group that carries through all 5 books.
Before we did our podcast right now, you and I had some private conversations, and I know you alluded that, throughout, as you were growing up, and you said yourself that this idea had been inside of you for quite some time, and you talked about like reading the Da Vinci Code and various other people who would write books about Catholicism and the Church. So would you say that those works really, again, goaded you and inspired you to make Hildegard come to life? Were they key influences? Absolutely.
I was really influenced by writers who did papal stories. Like one book that really affected me once I started getting interested in doing this kind of story, was a book called The Cardinal by Henry Morton Robinson. It's beautifully written. I think eventually it became a Hollywood movie But of course, there's the Thornbirds by Colleen McCullough. But the greatest influence on me was a writer by the name of Morris West. He was from Australia, and he did 3 papal stories, Vatican stories, fiction. One was called The Shoes of the Fisherman, which eventually became a movie in the 1960s starring Anthony Quinn. And then the second book called The Clowns of God, and the third book of that papal trilogy was called Lazarus. He was such an amazing writer, and those books just gripped me. I think I read each one 4 or 5 times, and they were a real inspiration to me. That way, if I could write a book and reach a goal of not copying somebody, but trying to follow their Vatican knowledge and priestly knowledge, I have that against me in the sense that I'm not a priest. I've never gone to school for that, and I'm not a theologian. But his writing and Henry Morton Robinson really captured the essence of priestly life, and especially Morris West, because his stories were Vatican-centered and about popes, that he captured what it was that a pope means to the world. And in essence, that's what my book is about, because the premise through all of them is that it's about a boy who eventually will become pope at the end of the world. And that's supposedly a pope called Peter II.
Okay. So you bring up your childhood. What was your educational background? Did you attend public school, or did you go to parochial school as a child?
No, I went to high school, and then from there I went to college. I'm actually a nurse. I'm a psychiatric nurse. I worked in a maximum security facility for 35 years. So yeah, that we'll be talking about Terry Sawchuk in a couple of months, and that psychiatric background really helped me with that story. But so nursing is my background, and then like I said, working in the psychiatric field for 35 years. But I always loved to write, and I published a lot of early books, but writing was just in me. You as you know, you're a great writer. It has to come out. It has to come out. And this story, pardon me, had to come out. I believe in fate. I believe we're all here for a reason. And the moment that I chose St. Hildegard, I live on Georgian Bay here in Penetanguishene. I live right on the water. Every morning I get up and I take sunrise pictures. And
they're beautiful, glorious pictures. I mean, sorry to interrupt, but David and I are Facebook friends and have been for quite some time. And you ever have the honor to link up with them? Those photographs are absolutely stunning, and one of my dreams is always to circumnavigate all 5 Great Lakes. And which lake is Penetanguishene on? Which lake is that? It's
on Georgian Bay, which is an arm of Lake Huron.
Well, the day I do the circumnavigation of Lake Huron, I want to stop at. I want to stop there and see what you see, because it's what he puts up on Facebook is glorious, absolutely glorious.
Yeah. Well, Georgian Bay is called the 6th Great Lake, so it's almost as large as Huron. So
now
I
in
have
your novels, in the series, in Hildegard, you invoke Penetanguishene, very beautifully too. I mean, so you were born and raised in Penetanguishene?
Born and raised, and never wanted to live anywhere else. And it was always my dream to live on the water and to write, living on and looking at the water. And so my dream came true, And I wanted to mention about my sunrises is the one morning I decided about Hildegard. I got up to take my usual picture. I only use an old iPhone, which is amazing. Yeah. And I'm on my deck, and the sun's coming up, and it's December 4th, 2016, and it looks like it's going to be a beautiful sunrise. And this is after a night of tossing and turning, and Hildegard's going to be the one that I'm choosing. She's going to be the thrust of all 4 or 5 novels. And the sun comes up, and shockingly, the way the sun intersected with a series of clouds, it formed a cross. And wow. It's hard to describe, but this cross lasted 8 minutes. I thought I was crazy. And if I didn't have 40 pictures to prove it, this cross stayed for 8 minutes. And I call it Hildegard's cross because it appeared when I had decided to pick her. And if I was looking for a sign from above that you're on the right track, I certainly got it that morning. And it lasted 8 minutes. I even took some pictures from in the house, and it was still there. So wow. That was my sign.
Do you have a website, David, where you could post these photographs? I mean, something you could share with our public? Is it on your personal, your promotional website by any chance?
Yes, I do. Well, you can catch them on my Facebook page. I have 2 of them. I have David Dupuis, and I have David M. Dupuis. David Dupuis is more to do with my writing, and we are about to put some pictures on there. But I'm just getting a website up and going. It's up and running. It's www.davidmdupuis.com, and you'll see the pictures there. Hopefully in the next short while. I've taken 9,000 pictures. I've taken 9,000, but I've narrowed it down to 400 that are absolute dandies. I don't think we'll post all 400, but for some reason, for a stretch of a 2.5-year stretch, I've noticed they're not as nice lately. That God, the Lord, the heavens, Hildegard, Sister Sunrise, I call her, she showed me these magnificent sunrises in that span of time that I thought I was dreaming. These beautiful sunrises, not to mention the cross that happened. It was amazing.
Getting back to your books, when you were writing in volumes 1 and 2, those passages where real life popes, Pius XII, and
Pius
John
XI, Pius XII, yes.
Yeah, are involved. I mean, they're speaking on it. What source materials were you using to get a sense and feel for their voices, their personalities, their thoughts and characters? What sources were you using, to capture their persona and all that?
Well, there have been many biographies written about those popes, and even the popes on into today. And Pope John Paul, I'm into book 3 right now. Pope John Paul II is in this book that I'm writing right now. But Pope John, I think I came across and bought, I think, 8 biographies on him. And I'm always searching about the popes. The one thing I didn't mention is that in 1978, when I started this thought of writing this story, it happened on the morning of the death of Pope John Paul I.
Wow.
And I was getting awake for work. I was waking up, and the radio was on, and they announced Pope John Paul I was dead. And for some reason, it really, really struck a nerve with me. And from that moment on, I started collecting newspaper articles and making papal scrapbooks about the popes. I presently have about 17 scrapbooks that are about 2 inches thick each. They pile up higher than my desk. So I've anything about popes, Vatican stuff, I read and then absorb, and so getting a feel for Pius XI, the 12th, John the 23rd, John Paul I, John Paul II, and now Pope Benedict, Pope Francis. I've got a pretty good read on them.
Do you feel that, I mean, in your books, you talk about, the church, Christianity and the church specifically coming under very attack. I mean, torn, between these dark forces trying to destroy the church and then the good forces trying to save the church. And here and now, in this present day and age, do you feel that Christianity as a whole and the Catholic Church specifically is coming under deliberate attack by dark forces in real life? What are your feelings on that? Do you have that sense of it?
Absolutely. When if you date back to Fatima, which is also part of my book one, and it's actually kind of carried through all 5 of my books, the 3 Secrets of Fatima. And one of the things that talks about is an apostasy, which is priest against priest. And another theme was that Russia would spread her errors. That's supposed to be one of the 3 secrets of Fatima. And, the church has so many issues. We can see now with the pedophile priests and attacks on children. To me, this is one of the biggest single issues that is going to come, and I believe destroy the church, because it is a real dark, deep sin that the church has been avoiding. They used to shuffle priests around so that they would stop hurting children, and of course, what would they do? They would hurt children wherever they were sent. So recidivism was a big issue. It's going to be a big issue. And I think it's one of the issues that could take the church down. Now, the church will never be down. We have to remember that, the church is people and the church is faith. And no matter what happens to the physical part of the church, if it had to ever, there are many churches that had to be sold to pay lawsuits and this kind of thing. And sometimes we get too caught up in the church and its physicalness. And really the church is much more than that. But the church is definitely under attack these days. And I in book 2 of Love and of Betrayal, we talk about a big part of Pope John's reign is the Second Vatican Council that he called. And there were many battles there. He wanted to bring the church up to date. He wanted to open the doors and the windows and let fresh air in. And there were major battles with the bishops about certain things. People thought John was crazy and, he had let the devil loose in the church. And but, amazingly, one of the biggest early battles of the council was just changing the language of the church from Latin to the vernacular. It was a huge battle. And actually, Cardinal Luciani, Albino Luciani, who eventually becomes Pope John Paul I and is only a pope for 34 days, but as he sat there and watched this huge battle over the language of the church that eventually the bishops voted on, and I believe it was voted 1,942 to something like 21 to change the language. And Albino Luciani was always struck by the fact that, wow, he couldn't it was such a simple, logical move, and yet there was so much vitriol about it. And he decided that maybe some of the old ways aren't always right. Maybe we should rethink things. And that was Pope John's great goal of calling the council, was that the church would update itself, come up to the modern day, and get with the times. There's a danger in doing that as well, because you're always opening up the church to forces that even Pope Francis today is contending with. Married priests, women priests, even giving communion to people who are divorced or living together. So there are forces within and without the church, no doubt.
It's not just internal scandals, though. I mean, I've noticed this myself personally. There seems to be like an attack from external forces, from non-Catholic forces. I've detected, at least in my country, a certain rise in anti-Catholicism ever since, Donald Trump has become president. I mean, I personally experienced this about a year or so ago. I mean, not just you see on the news, rises in anti-Semitic attacks, but there's also seems to be a lurking strain of anti-Catholicism too, at least in the United States. I don't know if anything like that is happening in Canada. I don't know. Have you observed anything like that, David?
I would say, well, Canada pretty well is a carbon copy of America in a lot of ways, and I would actually say that Christianity is under attack, and I take that theme through my novel, through all 5 books. That not only the Catholic Church, but all Christian religions are under attack, and you've got forces that are from the Middle East that are very anti-Christian, and it creates a real paranoia, a fear, and then you look internally into the Catholic Church and with its problems and its issues involving children and lack of faith, dropping participation, church going. It is completely, and all the Christian religions are experiencing that too.
Let's get back to Volume 2. Now, you said Volume 1 ends in 1958. Tell us about Volume 2 of Love and of Betrayal. So it begins in 58, and can you give us a little glimmer of the story there in Volume 2? Yeah,
Volume 2 takes place between 1958 and 1978, and it involves the papacies of John the 23rd, Paul the 6th, and John Paul I, as brief as it was. But the 3 popes are involved, and the decisions, and like I said, the Vatican Council, Second Vatican Council looms large through it. But I've had 2 big, strong issues to overcome in writing this book, because first, I didn't want the book to come across. I'm writing about popes, bishops, and cardinals, and yet I didn't want this churchy book to be too churchy. And as hard as that may seem to be, I think I accomplish it. I have a lot of readers who get back to me and say, no, you know what, you amazingly, your book is not too churchy. You center on the personalities and world issues, not only Catholic issues. And so the popes loom large, and there's this boy named Peter who will grow. And without giving too much of the story away, he will be under attack. The Antichrist is born in Book 2 as well. So I've had a big challenge in doing something I don't think anybody's ever done who writes historical fiction, and I think that's a genre that's just starting to grow, in that my story is so intertwined with modern history, starting from 1958. Like right now, Book 3, where I'm writing, I'm in 1984. A lot happened in the world in the 1980s. A lot happened to the Catholic Church, and but I'm weaving fictional stories, good guys, bad guys, with real life popes, bishops, cardinals, and world events, presidents. So without giving too much away, Book 2 is twice as thick as Book 1 in actual pages, almost, and it brings the reader on a voyage of self-discovery. You said Penetanguishene is in it, and it is, but really it's a story to the world. It involves New York City, It involves Penetanguishene, Toronto, Rome, and even New Mexico. Because I wanted this story to branch out. It's a world story, and I fear that in volumes 3, 4, and 5, my little hometown here will be going to the wayside because the story will get larger than life. And all through it is Hildegard.
It's kind of interesting. I know in your first volume, I noticed one of the characters was a New York Rangers fan. In your subsequent volumes, will you kind of have a little semi-hockey interest in there? Just a little, just a brief little mention, of hockey by any remote chance?
Absolutely. This young boy named Peter, who will be important to the world, in Volume 2, he plays hockey. He's a goaltender, yes.
He saves.
Yeah. So, not only do I have my hometown in here a little bit, you say you write about what you know. Well, I was a goaltender, and I've always been interested in goaltenders, of course, as you know about my writing, Terry Sawchuk. So, but of course, Peter becomes a goalie in Volume 2. For about 150, 60 pages worth of, without having too much hockey, but hockey is an integral. Every Canadian loves hockey. And so if you have a story about a young Canadian boy, of course there's going to be hockey involved. And that's why even in book 1, I had to throw the New York Rangers and Edgar Laprade in there and Madison Square Garden. And even in book 3, where I am right now, Madison Square Garden comes into the story.
Ooh, wow. You mentioned certain authors, that inspired you to do the Hildegard series. As you were growing up, who were some other favorite authors who really spurred you to become an author in your own right? Can you name me a few?
I really didn't do a lot of reading growing up. And I really can't remember authors. It's funny, I didn't start reading till got interested in the Vatican and the popes. The Cardinal, like I mentioned, was almost my first book that I really read, other than books you were forced to read in high school. Had to do a book report on. But I also love politics. And around the same time, I was a real John Kennedy fan, and I was too young to really know him. Though he is in book 2, he is partly in book 2. But there was a book written by 2 of his aides after he died, and it was called Johnny, We Hardly Knew Ye, and I loved that book. Do you? Yeah, I loved it. I loved it. It was well written. Written by 2 Irish guys like they were sitting around at a wake,
Yep, yeah. Ken O'Donnell and Dave Powers. They were in the limo right behind him when he was assassinated in Dallas. O'Donnell was like his appointment secretary, his gatekeeper, and Dave Powers was just basically he was his good friend. Just that good friend you need around
amazing,
you.
Yeah. And Dave Powers was apparently an amazing memory. He knew stats. He knew voter logs. He knew, he was legendary in Massachusetts.
Yeah. I remember one in Manchester, his book, A Brief Shining Moment, he dedicated to Dave Powers, said you stood with him on St. Crispin's Day, you stood with him. Yeah, which is
exactly
beautiful, Yeah. Oh, man. When can we expect the release of Volume 3, David? Do you have a guesstimate as the release date?
Matthew, you're starting to sound like the readers around here. I've got a large block of readers who all purchased, around the area, my own town, and they're already hounding me for book 3, and I'm in the middle of it. I've just put out book 2, and people are whizzing through it and going online, and they see me in town, and when is book 3? Are you kidding me? Book 3? I'm in the middle of it. having said that, I have kind of written 4 and 5, 3, 4, and 5.
Okay.
I had written them 40 years ago, and that was before the keys involved in Hildegard, and having grown as a writer, I read my early stuff and I go, wowzers, you certainly grow, and so I'm hoping book 3. I'm hoping it comes out maybe January, February. I'm hoping.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, don't worry. When it comes out, we'll talk about that one. Okay.
We're
going to talk
awesome.
about that one. Yeah. This time next year, we're going to talk about that. Okay. Kind of curious. Now, you mentioned earlier, in your younger days, you wrote 1,000 pages, basically amount of. How much of that early material are you incorporating in the present day books? I mean, did you have to do a lot of rewrite? I mean, you talked about going over the earlier stuff. How much did you have to rewrite, and how much were you able to retain with this present series?
Well, it was actually 2,000 pages, and it was all written in longhand. I didn't know how to type then, and it is, and it is all through all 5 books. It got typed up for me in the 1990s by a fabulous friend, and she was off work at the time, and she says, Hope's book there, I'll type that up for you if you want. And she spent months doing it, but and then so I just transferred that right through, popped it in all 5 books, and then as I'm rewriting and reweaving this story, some of the theme, back then that 2,000 pages was just basically about a boy who becomes a priest, a cardinal, and eventually pope. So that part of it there was all there even today, but it's all rewoven and rewritten, and but the essentials of what Peter is, who Peter is, what he becomes, was there 40 years ago. I'm just reworking the story, making it much deeper, much more interconnected with different plot lines, the good guys and the bad guys, like I said. I didn't have that in the beginning.
Tell me, this is your first attempt at fiction, correct? This is the first time you're ever doing a work of fiction. How difficult is it a transition from going from writing, histories of your native Ontario and also hockey bios to writing a work of fiction? Is it a difficult transition?
Well, the fiction part, it is, and I sometimes think I'm crazy because I'm doing something difficult as a historical fiction. I'm weaving in history, the popes, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vatican Council, and then later book 3, the assassination on the Pope. That all fiction and working in with the proper dates and what actually happened. With a historical fiction, you have to stay true to history. You can play with it a bit, but not. You can't deviate from the essence and the reality. But writing fiction is certainly something new, though. I captured a bit of doing that when I did the hockey bios, because hockey stories are told by word of mouth, by the people who relate the stories. It's in their words. And so that's even though that's history, it's kind of fiction, because you're weaving their story into words and sentences, paragraphs that people can relate to. They're telling you've got to tell that story properly. So in a sense, that helped me write this series, because there's a lot of dialogue in all the books. So writing those hockey dialogues certainly helped me with the fiction part. But I mean, I did read fiction as well growing up. The Thornbirds, I loved the Thornbirds. It was fictional. The Cardinals, fictional. So and Morris West, obviously, his trilogy was fictional as well. So you live and learn. My friend Pierre Pilote, the great defenseman, said he always learned by watching other people. And he says, why invent it? Just use what they did so well and go with it. And that's how I've tried to incorporate my writing of fiction.
Where can we purchase these first two volumes, David? Where can you find them in stores, or do they have to be purchased online?
They're online at Amazon.com or .ca. That's where they can be purchased. Also, Freestone Press, www.freestonepress.com, I think, or maybe .ca, but Freestone Press, type it in, you'll find it. They have an online bookstore, and my books are there. But yeah, I think right now the book one on Amazon.com, I think has come down in price a little bit, so that's a good thing.
David, I want to thank you so much for appearing on my show, and I'd just like to remind my listeners that 3 months from now, David will appear on my show again, where we will talk about his magnificent biography of the late Terry Sawchuk on what will be the 50th anniversary, the sad 50th anniversary of his death in 1970. And I just want to say that his bio on Sawchuk is a masterpiece, and my opinion, an epitome of what true great hockey literature should always be. And I look forward to David, I look forward to talking to you again 3 months from now. And I know just talking about the life of the late Terry Sawchuk, it's going to be an incredible interview. And I want to thank you for appearing on my show. Yes.
You're welcome. Thank you. Looking forward to it. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.
Okay.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.
Stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen, for next week's show, where I will be interviewing hockey author Todd Denault. Thank you and good night.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.